Snow drifted across the Ardennes, swallowing roads and forests in a white silence broken only by the rumble of German armor. It was December 1944, and Hitler's last great gamble, the Battle of the Bulge, had slammed into the American lines. In Bastogne, surrounded and outnumbered, American paratroopers dug foxholes into frozen earth. On Elsenborn Ridge, riflemen braced against waves of panzers, their breath fogging in the frigid air. The Germans believed they would shatter the Americans quickly, just as France had crumbled in 1940. To Berlin, these young GIs were untested, soft, and unwilling to pay the butcher's bill. But the Ardennes told a different story. Instead of collapse, the Americans held. They did not fight recklessly, nor did they waste lives in desperate charges. They fought with patience, firepower, and doctrine, a way of war uniquely their own, forged from logistics, artillery, and air power. The American way of war was not built on reckless bravery, but on method. At its core lay the doctrine of the holding attack. When a U.S. division met the enemy, one regiment was ordered forward, not to break through, but to hold the Germans in place. While that regiment fixed the enemy's attention, the real weapons of American power came into play: massed artillery and relentless close air support. Shells rained down with devastating precision, and fighter bombers screamed overhead, tearing into positions that once seemed impenetrable. Once the enemy was battered and pinned, the other regiments moved. They struck from the flanks, enveloping the defenders and forcing them from their lines. It was not elegant, but it was effective, a strategy designed to exploit American strengths in firepower and logistics rather than gamble with soldiers' lives. This stood in stark contrast to America's allies and enemies alike. The British often advanced cautiously, unwilling to risk sudden losses. The Russians hurled men forward in human waves, overwhelming German positions but leaving fields littered with their own dead. The Germans themselves favored aggressive counterattacks, often gambling everything to claw back lost ground. The Americans chose a different path. They were bold, but never reckless. Their doctrine, powered by a steady flow of food, fuel, and ammunition, was a machine of grinding inevitability. The holding attack meant fewer American lives wasted, more pressure on the enemy, and above all, a rhythm of battle that the Germans could resist only for so long. Beneath the doctrine lay a simple but powerful design: the factor of 3. The U.S. Army organized itself like a pyramid of repeating patterns. 3 squads formed a platoon. 3 platoons built a rifle company. 3 rifle companies made a battalion. 3 battalions became a regiment, and 3 regiments formed a division. This structure was more than bookkeeping, it was strategy made tangible. Each unit knew its place and role. When one regiment was engaged in the holding attack, the others were not scattered or improvised. They were positioned to maneuver, to strike, or to reinforce. The system was scalable, predictable, and above all, reliable. For the men on the line, this mattered. A platoon pinned down in a hedgerow or a foxhole knew they were never alone. Somewhere behind them, another element was ready to take the fight forward. Reserves were not abstract promises, but baked into the very bones of the organization. The rhythm of 3 meant that no single unit carried the full burden of battle for long. It also gave commanders a mathematical certainty. One could always be held in place, one maneuvered, and one kept in reserve. It was doctrine expressed in numbers, a formula that allowed the United States to fight with consistency across Europe's fields and forests. To the Germans, who often relied on improvisation and the initiative of local commanders, this predictability seemed almost mechanical. But to the Americans, it was reassurance. Reinforcements would come. Support would arrive. No regiment fought or died alone. If the Americans had designed their doctrine to spare lives, the Germans made them spend every ounce of effort to claim ground. Nowhere in Europe did the Wehrmacht simply give way. In Italy, in Normandy, in the Ardennes, German units dug in fortified villages and resisted until they were either annihilated or forced out. Surrender was rare. Retreat, rarer still. Against this kind of stubborn defense, the holding attack showed its worth. Instead of ordering wave after wave of infantry to storm machine guns, American commanders fixed the Germans in place, then unleashed what they excelled at: overwhelming firepower. Artillery spoke first, time-on-target barrages blanketing the enemy with steel and shrapnel. Then came the shriek of thunderbolts and Mustangs diving low, scattering defenders who had once prided themselves on their iron discipline. A village in Normandy might serve as an example. German machine guns raked the approaches, pinning down an American regiment. For hours, the defenders believed they had blunted the attack. Then the earth shook. American artillery rained down, collapsing stone walls into rubble. Minutes later, P-47s screamed overhead, their bombs cracking bunkers wide open. When the smoke lifted, the defenders were no longer defiant. They were retreating through shattered streets, leaving behind only silence and ruin. The holding attack denied the Germans their favorite weapon, the chance to bleed an enemy white through frontal defense. Against Russia, they had inflicted millions of casualties that way. Against America, the calculus was different. The Americans would not play the game of attrition on German terms. They would pin, pound, and flank, grinding forward step by step, until even the most stubborn strongpoint crumbled. The holding attack was not only an offensive doctrine, it was a mindset that shaped how Americans defended. When the Germans struck back, especially in the Ardennes in December 1944, the expectation in Berlin was simple: the Americans would break. After all, the French army had crumbled in weeks in 1940. Surely, these young GIs would do the same under the weight of panzers and artillery. But collapse never came. Instead, the Americans bent, withdrew, and then formed what commanders called hedgehog positions. In towns like St. Vith and Bastogne, or along the frozen ridges near Elsenborn, small pockets of resistance dug in. Surrounded, low on supplies, often cut off from command, they refused to yield. What held them together was more than stubbornness. It was doctrine, and it was faith in the larger machine of American war. Soldiers knew that relief would come, that reinforcements were always moving forward, that artillery never stopped firing, and that once the skies cleared, Allied air power would hammer the enemy into retreat. At Bastogne, paratroopers of the 101st Airborne held out for days against superior numbers, turning the town into a fortress that denied the Germans vital roads. At Elsenborn Ridge, infantry and engineers alike dug in through snow and ice, repelling attack after attack until German momentum broke. This resilience under pressure was as decisive as any offensive. The Germans could encircle, overwhelm, and batter, but they could not collapse American lines the way they once had in France. The U.S. Army had built not only a way to attack, but a way to endure. For days in December 1944, the fog and snow seemed to favor the Germans. Their spearheads pushed deep into the Ardennes, tanks rumbling through villages, infantry spilling into frozen woods. American units clung to ground by sheer grit, but the skies remained silent. The one advantage they counted on had been grounded by winter storms. Then the weather broke. On December 23rd, the clouds lifted, and with them came the full weight of American firepower. The skies filled with Allied aircraft, P-47 Thunderbolt strafing convoys, B-26 bombers tearing apart supply lines, Mustangs circling overhead like hawks. At the same time, U.S. artillery unleashed a fury that shook the forests. Time-on-target barrages landed with devastating precision, shells from dozens of batteries arriving on German positions simultaneously, leaving no chance for cover. Suddenly, the tide turned. The holding attack, so often used to contain German defenses, now reversed. American divisions advanced in synchronized strikes. One regiment pinned a spearhead, while others flanked and cut off the attackers. What had been a German offensive became a grinding counteroffensive by the Americans, each movement deliberate, each blow coordinated. A German officer later recalled that the artillery fire was so intense it shattered not just positions, but morale itself. Tanks bogged down, infantry scattered, and the momentum that had once carried the Wehrmacht westward dissolved in smoke and fire. By January, the bulge in the Allied lines was gone. The Germans had gambled their last reserves, and the Americans had proven not only that they could hold, but that they could strike back with crushing inevitability. By the spring of 1945, the thunder of German blitzkrieg was little more than an echo. The fast-moving columns of armor, the sudden breakthroughs, the aura of unstoppable momentum, all had been blunted and broken. What remained was a German army fighting desperately on the defensive, stretched thin, and crushed by a war machine that had mastered the art of patience. The American doctrine of logistics, firepower, and flexible tactics now dominated the battlefield. Ammunition and fuel flowed without pause. Artillery spoke with precision and consistency. Air power prowled the skies whenever the weather cleared. And behind it all, the rhythm of the factor of 3 kept units steady, predictable, and resilient. For the soldier in the foxhole, this meant survival. He did not need to throw himself into suicidal charges. He did not have to fight recklessly or alone. Instead, he could trust the system, that his regiment would hold, that his artillery would answer, that his comrades would flank and finish the fight. The war in Europe was still brutal, still costly, but the Americans had found their own way of war. It was not about sheer recklessness, nor about avoiding battle. It was about grinding forward, step by step, until the enemy had nothing left to give. In the end, as one veteran later put it, they didn't fight fair, they fought smart, and that made all the difference. What do you think? Did the American way of war save lives, or did it prolong the fight? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more untold stories of history.